So today I decided to do yet another video on trauma bonding because trauma bonding is an extremely important subject to discuss and keep discussing. Now, as we all know, the way trauma bonding works is through abuse and savior behavior by the same person. We often riddle that in the way that we address the behavior as Jekyll and Hyde. And yes, we all know about the abductor and abductee situation where the victim becomes attached to the perpetrator. We know about it, but do we really understand it? So let's talk about the psychological aspect. A child is abducted and left in a cold, dark basement. No windows, no lights, tied to a bed. Mice and creepy noises in the room keep the child horrified. So after hours, maybe days of experiencing that high volume of emotional terror, the abductor comes in to see the child, turns on a light, lets the child go to a bathroom, gives food and water, and even sits with the child for a time. So what's happening here is the abductor is actually rescuing the child both emotionally and intentionally, of course. The child, although still afraid, feels some relief. It's better than being tied up in the dark. So later, the abductor returns to the first behavior. We'll call the abductor a he. So he ties the child back up, lights off, and the child goes back to the terror of a dark room with mice and noises, leaving the child feeling completely unsafe again. So the cycle begins. The visits from the abductor are random. They can be sometimes every day and sometimes every other day, and other times several days go by until he comes back into the room. So the relief is unorganized. It's completely random, where the child cannot even count on a timeline. So it goes something like this. The second time that the abductor comes to bring relief to the child trusts a little bit more. So stage one, at first in the beginning, the child feels a tinge of safety but still feels leery. Regardless, it still feels better than the terror of the dark room and the monsters. Then you go to stage two. The next few times that the abductor comes into the room and saves the child, for a time that child feels again a little safer because once again the abuser has been displaying an act of kindness by providing relief to the child. The child is once again saved, and having been rescued, another little flicker of trust starts to develop. Stage three, although there's no organized timeline, it still remains that the abductor is the only one that can save the child at this point, and this is the only hope that the child has, so dependency begins. Stage four, now the child begins to focus only on when he or she gets rescued again. Looks forward to the visits due to not only the fear of darkness, but the aloneness that the child feels. The child begins to see the abductor more as savior than abductor. The child feels attached to the abductor because of the saving that he does, and the mind sees it as being cared for and loved. So we've associated this trauma bond through an abductor kidnap situation from a psychopath. But what about trauma bonding in other situations? Is that even possible? Yes, it is, and you know it is, and it happens in all types of dynamics. Trauma bonding can develop between parent-child, student-teacher, coach-child, husband-wife, and so on. You don't need to be physically kidnapped to be trauma bonded in the sense that someone is trying to force you into a van, for example. You become trauma bonded by being mentally and emotionally kidnapped, which in turn does become physical, which I do explain in another video. You know, so often we hear the victims of narcissistic abuse often state that they feel stuck and they don't know how to get out of their situations. They are stuck. It doesn't matter whether this being stuck is financial or emotional. Stuck is stuck. The emotional stuckness is fear. Your belief system is defective at this point. The voice that says, I can't make it on my own. The attachment forms as a means of survival. When a child is born, they naturally become attached to parents. The dependency is a means of survival, because obviously the infant needs them for everything. They need them for food, for comfort, for love, all in all, for safetiness. And with that, dependency forms an attachment. Now, where a child is raised in a normal, safe, and love environment, the child grows up and individualizes. But when abusive situations where the child grows up not feeling safe, not feeling loved, not feeling enough or wanted, that person does not individualize from the energy of that experience. The adult is still trying to fix it. It's still in the energy field. In narcissistic abuse, that urge to reconnect is not the real problem here. The issue is the trauma that was never resolved that keeps you attached to this narcissist. Now, when abuse is involved, the child often blames self because there's other times where mommy or daddy are loving, or at least make them feel safe sometimes. Parents to a child are godlike and all-knowing, so how could that loving parent be the bad one? It must be the child. It must be me, the child thinks. I mustn't be enough, and I'm just going to have to do it better. So as the child grows into adulthood, they associate love and abuse in the same category. And that category, titled as normal, the child sees that when I'm extra good, mommy and daddy are happy. But when I'm not special good, they don't love me. They don't see me. Now, in order to create an attachment like that, the trauma bond develops under certain conditions. And there are two main factors involved in establishing a trauma bond. Number one, power imbalance. And the goal here is to control, intimidate, and influence the victim to feel that they don't have an equal voice in the relationship. So examples of tactics are isolation. The partner is going to try to segregate relationships with family members or friends by means like making it uncomfortable to have them over or putting them down in front of said victim, things like that, so as not to have others influence them by empowering the victim. Another tactic is monitoring. That can be monitoring your time, what you do with your time, where you've been, who you've been with, monitoring what you say, how you say it. The victim is constantly under stress and fears upsetting the abuser because they don't know when chaos will ensue. They're walking on eggshells all the time, and the relationship feels like a father to child or mother to child relationship. Another tactic, finances. Partner does not allow them to be financially independent, and that can be done covertly, like partner manipulating the victim and believing that it's better that they stay home with the promise that they'll be looked after. I say that one often because a lot of my clients talk about that. It happens to so many victims of abuse where they're made to stay home. So another tactic can be to have the victim fired by saying terrible, untrue things about the victim without the victim having any clue that the partner was involved. Another way is by secretly damaging the partner's vehicle or outright making the victim feel that they can't do their job correctly. If the victim tries to better themselves by returning to school, for example, the partner could purposely provoke fights so that the victim can't concentrate on their studies. Or the abuser may not want to pick up children to and from places such as school or hockey games, for example, so as to interfere in the victim's studies. And finally, another example or tactic that they can use is through communication. The victim tries to voice opinion and gets shut down through things like rolling of the eyes and nods of disapproval or blatantly laughing. So the victim tries to ask for what they want, and the abuser shuts down communication by gaslighting, word salad, rage, name calling. You know the drill. So the victim learns to shut down in order to survive. If I don't make noise, I'm not going to be put down, or I'm not going to be attacked, and so on and so forth. Assuring the victim has no voice or opinions or anything that matters to them. Number two, intermittent reinforcement. The goal is to wear down and confuse the victim, which is where brainwashing occurs because confusion techniques make people more suggestible. Confusion is a tactic often used in hypnosis. Intermittent reinforcement is where a perpetrator goes back and forth from kind, loving to abusive and unkind. Jekyll and Hyde. The partner of the abuser becomes exhausted and void of energy after days, weeks, sometimes months of being ignored and or name called. The victim experiences their days filled with pain, and when the abuser finally decides to move up cycle stages and gives his or her victim a few crumbs, endorphins get released. And endorphins get released from the nervous system. Endorphins are chemicals that are made up of a large group of peptides. They're often called feel-good chemicals. Endorphins also reduce or weaken the awareness of the pain, which is why our perception of the situation in the case of narcissistic personality disorder abuse is often diminished, and we all tell ourselves it's not so bad. The victim feels a sort of a high because of these endorphins. They feel relief. Now the victim links this feeling to the abuser, and you now have an addiction created, which will in turn cause physical withdrawals long after the relationship ends. It's all based on terror, domination, and unpredictability. So as a trauma bond between victim and abuser gains strength and it deepens, it leads to conflicting feelings of alarm, numbness, and grief that shows up in a cyclical pattern. More often than not, the victims do not have agency and autonomy. They don't have an individual sense of self. They become an extension of the other, just like the narcissist wanted. Their self-image is a derivative and an internalization of the abuser's conceptualization of them. Trauma bonds have severe detrimental effects over the victim, not only while the relationship is in existence, but beyond that as well. In this coercive control, the abuser uses tactics such as positive reinforcement, such as praise, superficial charm, flattery, love bombing, gifts, attention, and then negative reinforcement like taking away items from the victim, nagging, silent treatment, ignoring, provoking, emotional blackmail, guilting, verbal abuse, explosive anger, degradation, so on and so forth. So an interesting study was conducted by an American psychologist named B.F. Skinner, short for Berhus Frederick Skinner, involving rats in an approach that he called operant conditioning. It was a box or chamber, as he referred to it, where the rats learned that by pressing a specific lever, these food pellets would drop. The second lever that was placed produced electrical shocks. And it didn't take very long until the rats learned both levers and avoided the painful lever. After some time, Skinner changed things up, where the food pellets came out sometimes, and sometimes no pellets came out at all. And what was observed was that the rats continued pressing the lever to get the pellets. And again, after some time, he changed things up again. This time, no matter how often the rat pressed the lever, food pellets never dropped. But it didn't stop them from pressing that lever. They became obsessed with it, and in turn neglected their own personal hygiene and family commitments. The rats had become addicted, which is a perfect example of intermittent reinforcement, where the rats could never predict when it would receive a reward or a cookie crumb. Now we as victims are still pressing that lever, waiting for that next cookie crumb. And the thing is that the urge to get that next crumb of kindness and love from our partner isn't even the real issue to begin with. It's only a symptom. The addiction to get love and acceptance comes from the trauma that is still in the body, that is causing the addiction today. The initial trauma bond is from parent or caregiver growing up in most cases. And don't get me wrong here, the narcissist is still trauma bonding you and is now reinforcing that addiction. But let's take a look at some case scenarios in which the attraction to a partner can take place. Example A. A person grows up never feeling special and has been deprived of attention growing up. Meets the partner who goes above and beyond, making them feel special. The partner shouts to the world how special that person is through displays like dancing with them in the middle of a grocery aisle, for example, or maybe randomly showers them with gifts out of the blue. The person is so romantic and so out there in shows of displays of this love that the victim would actually be bored in a healthy relationship because they just never could get that high, that reward, and they wouldn't want to give that up. The second example, a person raised like Cinderella, made to be a caregiver, responsible for everyone and everything in a cold upbringing and never made to feel safe, meets their knight in shining armor. This person has money, is willing and wanting to take care of the victim. So now the victim feels seen, feels cared for, and feels safe. Example C. Here I'm going to use my own experience as an example. I too had been severely ignored as a child and quickly learned to be the caretaker in order to survive. But I took care of so many people for so many years and experienced several abusive relationships that I eventually became ill. And I ended up having to close down my practice. So now in my dilemma, I ended up having to rent out some of my space in order to keep up with my mortgage while I tried to figure out what was wrong with me and how I was going to heal my body. And I also want to add that my father was always saying that I would never amount to anything or I would never make it on my own. And that one was a big deal for me, being told that I would never make it on my own. So I ended up getting one degree after another to prove him or myself wrong. And I had my businesses, I had my houses. When I was single, I was always successful. But put me in a relationship and the scapegoat in me always offered herself up to play the part. Growing up, I always felt stressed out and I could never count on anyone to remove the fear that I so often felt from different things like being bullied in school, from too much responsibilities, or from this strange entity that visited me in my room night after night. I would scream and my parents would come running in the room and they'd walk right through this entity. And then they'd tell me that it was just a nightmare and just go back to sleep. No comforting me at all. But anyway, the man that I rented a shared space with immediately became my friend and quickly became my lover. Not for long though. I didn't feel that couple's love that one is supposed to feel in new relationships, but he made me feel safe. I felt safe when he cleaned my eavesdrops when I was too ill to do it, and that took away a lot of my stress. I felt safe when he sat by my side and reassured me that I was going to be okay every time another one of my strange symptoms showed up, as he would explain what was happening to me. He was extremely knowledgeable in autoimmune diseases. He was cerebral, which was my case. And that's how he got his supply, because now I'm seeing him as the savior. So that was a huge trauma bond with this man. Someone made me feel safe in my unsafe world. Trauma bonds happen when the victim develops affection or sympathy for the abuser. Now, affection we can all understand. When someone's being really nice to us, affection for that person can develop. But sympathy for someone who's constantly insulting us, berating us, calling us horrible names, again, it goes back to intermittent reinforcement. Now, if the person that you met was always a terrible person, you would call them jerks and want nothing to do with them because you're not crazy here, right? But in the case of narcissistic abuse, you have this intermittent reinforcement going on where you not only experience the bad, but also the good. And when you encounter the good, it can be really good. They can be superheroes. So when they step into the bad energy, you as an empath feel and understand the pain that your partner is in. You just know that the real person down deep is this wonderful person. But what you don't know is that this wonderful person that shows up is a false self. And it's really hard for people like us to wrap our heads around that as empaths. Now, the other part is guilt. Guilt is defined by remorse or self-reproach caused by feeling that one is responsible for a wrong offense. We feel bad for hurting someone, even if that person's hurting us. We feel bad because we were taught to be responsible for everyone else's comfort and happiness. And if we missed the mark on that one, that was on us. So let's take a look now at how we as traumatized children grow up. Number one, childhood trauma. The child abandoned, ignored intentionally or not, or abused sexually or other. Number 2, child now believes that abuse is part of love because it's normal. Number 3, child now becomes closed down. Child learns to stay invisible and not make waves so that they can receive love again. If I don't ruffle any feathers and remain good, I won't be hated. Number 4, child becomes scapegoat and takes all the blame. Number 5, the child becomes an adult and ends up in a similar relationship and continues the behavior of not making waves along with being extra good. For example, doing more, giving more than the partner gives, and settling for crumbs. The adult continues to take responsibility for the well-being of the abusive partner and sees the partner's needs as more important, even often telling self that they're strong enough to handle it. And they may rationalize by saying that they're more mature, for example, and they continue to find ways to be good enough. Number 6, in turn, abusive partner continues to wave the bone and take it away. Intermittent reinforcement. And number 7, just like the rat in Skinner's experiment, when the rat obsessively presses the lever, ignoring everything else around him, the same goes with the dynamics in trauma bonding. The child within is still pressing that lever in desperation to get love or safety so needed from mom or dad or caregivers. And so why is it that something from the past is still affecting what's happening today? It's all in the mind-body connection, which you can learn about in my video called The 6 Stages that the narcissist uses to create a trauma bond, which I'll leave up in this video. Okay, so I've run my mouth long enough in this video here, so for those of you interested in more, check out that video, and we shall see you in the next video. Bye for now.